Hello, everyone, and welcome to online lecture 15. So today we're going to talk about experimental methods and specifically control techniques. So let me start off with giving you a couple of just points to note. Random selection, as it turns out, is rarely used. Purposive and convenient samples are typically used. So how do we get to external validity if there's no random selection? Because we talked about last time that random selection is one of the best ways to get external validity. Well, the truth is that external validity tends to be increased by replication. In other words, repeating the study again and again and again with different samples. Okay, so for today, we are going to assume that the researcher already has a sample, however they got that, and our focus will be on these control techniques that we're going to start talking about in a moment. So in an ideal world, here is how things would work. We would have, if we're doing a study about college professors, and we're going to have two groups, then we would start off with a population of individuals consisting of all college professors. We would randomly select a sample of 50 college professors, and then we would randomly assign the sample to two treatment groups. Treatment group A, 25 professors, treatment group B, 25 professors. So this is, of course, an ideal. I already shared with you that random selection rarely occurs. So the random assignments, though, we can focus on, and that is a great technique for helping out when you're trying to do an experiment, when you're trying to get at causality. So what is our goal of experimentation? Okay, well, it's to identify the causal effect of the independent variable, or IV, on the dependent variable, or DV. In other words, does the IV cause the DV? And we talked about all the conditions that must occur, and we really must have internal validity to do this, which means we have to control our extraneous variables. We have to control our extraneous variables. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, that kind of means we have to eliminate differential influence. The influence of an extraneous variable is different for the various groups. And if that sounds very similar to you to a confounding extraneous variable, then good, because it should, because that's the idea, right? We're trying to make sure that if we have an extraneous variable, at least it doesn't have this differential influence on one group versus another, okay? Because that's when we get into that confounding business. Okay. So we're going to talk about control techniques at different phases of an experiment. We're going to start with control techniques at the beginning of a study or at the beginning of an experiment. So random assignment. I've been talking to you about this, telling you how important it is. We're going to talk about it again. A control technique to equate groups of participants. It's a control technique to equate groups of participants. It ensures that every member has an equal chance of being assigned to any group. Now, while it does not eliminate extraneous variables, it randomly distributes them across the groups. And that works out to be quite healthy for an experiment, okay? It works out to really help out our experiment get closer to causality. And this is the most important and powerful control technique. So I wanted to share with you, if you're wondering, how would I even go about random assignment? Well, you could produce a group of random numbers, right? You could pretend you're flipping a coin, except do it by producing random numbers, ones and twos, let's say. You could produce a list of ones and twos, and whoever gets the one is in the experimental group, and whoever gets the two is in the control group. And if you wanted to produce a random set of numbers, you could do that using www.random.org. It's one of my favorite randomizing sites for numbers. Okay. So here's a random assignment example. Okay. Here we have some group assignment based on arrival sequence, and we're looking at the participants 1 through 10 and 11 through 20, and this is the order they arrived in. And we look at their IQ scores, and we see that in Group A, the average is 106.1, and in Group B, the average is 116.7. What a big difference. On the other hand, when we do random assignment of participation to groups, we're much less likely to have this problem. And you can see that in this particular example, in Group A, the average IQ score was 111.5, versus in Group B, the average IQ score was 111.3. Much, much, much closer, and we like that, right? If there's, whether we're looking at IQ or not, we would love for that variable to be equally distributed across our groups, right? Unless, of course, that's the one we're intervening with. But we want at the beginning of our study, even if it is the one we're intervening with, to be equal across our groups, okay? Then maybe we'll be looking for changes later on. Okay, all right. So random assignment, we like it. It helps get either our IV or other variables equal across our groups, equally distributed. Okay, let's talk about matching a little bit. Now, these are techniques to equate participants in the treatment groups on specific variables, such as intelligence, age, or gender. The advantages of matching is that it controls for the variables on which participants are matched. You typically want to do this with your extraneous or confounding variables, either just general extraneous or extraneous confounding variables. Okay, all right. So let's look at some matching techniques. First, we could hold variables constant. If we're looking at a gender and conformity study, maybe we'll only use people identifying as female. That's holding a variable constant. That way we don't have to worry if there might be more males in one group and more females in another group or another gender, and they're having a different effect, and et cetera, right? We could hold it constant. What's the study? What's the problem of this? You restrict the population size and you restrict the ability to generalize. Okay? And if we're only studying females, we can't generalize to anyone else, just females. Okay? Next, we could build the extraneous variable into the research design using blocking. In other words, you make the extraneous variable another IV in the study. Okay. So let's say I am interested in looking at the number of hours people are assigned to sleep in a given night and their cognitive performance on a task the next day. Okay. So if I used matching, I might want to, just as we looked at in the previous example, I might want to look at IQ. I might want to match my groups on IQ, and I might even do that by building the extraneous variable into the research design, by blocking it out, by making sure I have an equal number in each group, okay, with similar IQ. All right, so I could make it another, but the thing is, you only want to do that when it's really of interest. Only if that variable is of interest, because there is a cost to doing it. So let's talk about some other options. Let's talk about the yoked control. This one matches participants on the basis of the temporal sequence of administering of an event. So let's look at an example, because that's kind of a mouthful. Let's say a researcher wants to know the effect of students having the freedom to choose snack breaks on their classroom productivity. Okay, so maybe that's true. Maybe for second graders, it's more productive if they get to choose when their snack break is. How am I going to test this? How am I going to test this? Okay. Because if I let my second graders choose their time, and then I have my comparison group who's all given their snack break at 11 a.m., then the times don't match up, and that's not good necessarily, right? So I can do this yoked control. So here's how it works. Every person in my experimental group who gets to choose their own snack break is yoked or tied to a member in my control group. Okay. Now, the experimental participants take a self-chosen snack break. So person A in the experimental group chooses their snack break at 10:15 a.m. Now, their matching counterpart in the control group will receive a snack at 10:15 a.m. They didn't choose that. That's just when they're going to get it, because that's when person A in the experimental group chose it. Person B in the experimental group chooses a snack break at 1:15 p.m. Their corresponding counterpart in the yoked control group receives a snack break at 1:15 p.m. Okay, so that's how that one works. Then you could match by equating participants. So you could equate participants on a potential extraneous variable. And you can do that to match case by case and then randomly assign to groups. Now, the disadvantage of that is you have to figure out which variables you really want to match on. What's really the most important here? And matching participants increases as the number of variables on which to match increases. Right? So the more variables you want to match on, the more participants you need to do this. And some variables are very difficult to match on. You can also suffer a decrease in the generalizability of your results by matching, because you're controlling, you're taking that control. It may not be as natural. Okay. So here's an individual matching example. And this time we're very interested in matching on IQ. I think this is critical in this study to match on IQ. So we have all these people who we've assessed their IQ. And what we do is we look at these and we see, oh, great, Sarah and Brian have the same IQ of 110. Isn't that wonderful? We'll randomly assign them, one to the treatment group and one to the control group. Same with Jane and Kathy, randomly assign them. Same with Donald and Jake, and same with Debbie and Jody. And isn't it wonderful that we had exact matches on IQ for these participants? Now, of course, this would be a difficult variable to match on, because trying to find such a tight match on IQ when there's so many continuous variable with a lot of values would be a challenge. But if you can do it, then your average IQ by group is guaranteed to be the same. Remember, through random assignment, in general, had we just randomly assigned these people to different groups, it probably would have worked out that their IQs would be similar. But if you need to guarantee that, then you can individually match. Okay. All right, so that's individual matching. Now let's talk about some control techniques during the study, during the experiment. All right. So the big one I want to talk to you about is counterbalancing. Now, this is only used with repeated measures designs or longitudinal designs, okay? So when we have participants who are going to be tested or observed or what have you multiple times. So in counterbalancing, we could do something where all participants receive all treatment conditions. Okay. And this can be used to control two types of sequencing effects: order effects, such as practice or fatigue, right? So if I give you the same test twice, either maybe it exhausts you or maybe you get practice and you get better. Either way, it had an effect. Or carryover effects, where the effects of treatment A are still affecting the participant while they're engaged in treatment B. Okay, so with the first one, you might think of an example of a driving simulator, okay? And let's say we want to figure out if people will perform best in the driving simulator when they have no phone, a handheld phone, or a hands-free phone. Well, if we just put all the people in there first when they have a handheld phone, and then put them in second when they have a hands-free phone, and then put them in third when they have no phone, and I say, wow, the people who had no phone did the best. You might be saying, hey, there's a problem with your study, right? They got practice in the driving simulator each time, so no surprise that no phone came out the best. And when we're thinking of carryover effects, an example might be medications, right? If you have the effects of treatment A still affecting you, that med is still affecting someone when they're engaged in treatment B. Okay. All right. So one thing we could do is what's called randomized counterbalancing. Okay. Now, in this case, each participant is randomly assigned to a sequence. So if you have an IV, an independent variable with 3 levels, there are 6 possible sequences, right? So let's go back to our example that we were just talking about with the phone and the driving simulator. So if no phone is A and hands-free phone is B and handheld phone is C, then there are 6 possible sequences, 6 different orders a person could complete the study in, right? No phone, handheld, or excuse me, no phone, hands-free, handheld, or no phone, handheld, hands-free, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we could vary the order. And if we had a study with 60 people in it, then maybe 10 people would receive the first order. Another 10 would receive the second order. Another 10, 10, 10, 10, and we'd get to 60. And each person would get a randomized assigned sequence. Okay. Now, you might not like that either. You might say that, well, it could work out that some participants, even though they're randomly assigned, still have differential effects, and there could be participant characteristics that influence this. So we could do inter-subject counterbalancing, where participants take multiple sequences. So here's our same example, IV with 3 levels. There are 6 possible sequences, and each participant is exposed to multiple sequences. Okay. So within that, we could have a complete counterbalancing example where all possible sequences of treatment condition are used. In other words, let's go back for just a moment to our sequences, our sequence possibilities. First, a participant does no phone, hands-free, handheld. Then they do no phone, handheld, hands-free. Then they do hands-free, no phone, handheld. You get the idea? They're doing all of these. My goodness, how much are you putting these participants through? Because they've got to do all of these sequences. That's a lot to ask of any participant. Okay. As you might understand, therefore, it's randomly used with more than 3 conditions. Because 3 conditions yields 6 sequences, 4 conditions yields 24 different possible sequences. That's a lot. It's too much. Okay. So then we have incomplete counterbalancing, where not all possible sequences are used. This is a very clever approach. This is much more commonly used than complete counterbalancing. Okay. Now here's how it works. Each treatment condition must appear an equal number of times in each position. Okay. So in other words, the no phone would have to appear an equal number of times in position 1, 2, and 3. Same for the other two. And each treatment condition must precede and be followed by every other condition an equal number of times. That's a lot to hold in your head. So thankfully, someone has done it for us. And if you just look at this, in this case, we have four treatment conditions. And person 1 receives them in the order of A, B, D, C. Person 2 receives B, C, A, D, and so on and so forth. But you can see the A appears, A, in each of the conditions, in each of the orders, right? Here it's first, here it's second, here it's third, here it's fourth. Here it's preceded by C and followed by D. Here it's preceded by D and followed by C. And if you went through and checked all of the criteria, you would see that this actually works. Okay. So what's the potential disadvantage of a incomplete counterbalancing example? Well, a treatment condition might affect participants' performance in a later condition in one way and in another way when followed by a different condition. In other words, let's say that drug A has a differential carryover effect when followed by B than when followed by C, right? So that could be a problem there. Okay, it's a pretty good deal though, the incomplete counterbalancing. Like I said, it's used quite a bit and it's a pretty good deal. Okay, all right. So as I said, you could have differential carryover. If the carryover from treatment A is greater when it's immediately followed by B than when it's immediately followed by C, it could be a problem. All right. All right, what about controlling those participant effects that we talked about before, right? Well, one thing you can do is what's called a double-blind placebo method. Okay? Neither the researcher nor the research participants know which treatment condition is administered to the participant. Neither knows who is in the placebo and control groups. Okay? So in this case, someone has to know, right? But maybe what you have is someone, you have a research assistant or maybe a nurse or something, if this is a medication study, who knows what it is. But when they give it to the actual researcher, they give the pills to the researcher, they don't tell them, oh, is this the experimental pill or is this the control pill? Okay. And so they don't know and the participant doesn't know. All right. A single blind placebo method would only keep one of those groups blind. It would either keep the research participants blind or it would keep the researcher blind. But the double blind is ideal for many situations because neither one knows. Okay. Now, let's talk about deception a little bit. Deception is used when there is really no other way to gain the knowledge and the risk does not outweigh the benefit of the information. Okay. But if you're going to do deception or present false information, you want to keep that constant across your participants. So the omission of, the altering of truth of the information given to a participant is used. I've actually used it before in a study when I was doing a study to look at anonymous codes that could be used to match people across data points. So in other words, a longitudinal study, right? And you want to keep your participants anonymous. The problem is, how am I going to match them up from session A to session B if I keep them anonymous? So we came up with this. There actually other people have come up a long time ago with this technique of longitudinal codes, or excuse me, of these anonymous codes that can be used to match people longitudinally. What we wanted to see is if this code would actually work under duress. In other words, if the participant believed that they were going to have to provide sensitive information later on in the study, would they still feel good providing anonymous codes? So we told participants, you're going to be asked to provide very sensitive information later on in the study. We never asked them to do that. That was the deception. We just wanted them to believe that to see how well they felt about the codes, thinking that they would be asked for sensitive information. It was a deception. We undid the deception at the end, right? We debriefed them. And we explained why the deception was necessary. But that's the idea of deception. And it is one way to control participant effects. We can also try to control participants' interpretation. These are techniques that are used to gain insight into participants' perceptions of the experiment. So you could ask the participant when they're done, hey, what was this study about in your opinion? What did you think? What was this about? What was that about, right? You can ask for a retrospective verbal report. And that's good. But sometimes people prefer actually to find out right in the moment what the participant is thinking. Now that's called a concurrent verbal report. And there's different ways to do a concurrent verbal report. First, there's what's called sacrifice groups. These are groups of participants who are stopped and interviewed at different stages of the experiment. Okay, why are they called sacrifice groups? Because you have to sacrifice that data. If you're going to stop them and interview them in the middle of the study, you're of course kind of messing up what you intended to do in your study. And so you get to learn what they were thinking, which is good, but you're going to have to sacrifice them. Now, you might want to do this in the case that you are trying to get a very specific effect out of participants, and you need to know if it's working. So there's a very good reason to do it. Just bear in mind you sacrifice that data. Okay, next, concurrent probing. Obtaining a participant's perception of the experiment after completion of each trial. Okay, at least this way you don't really wreck anything because you're doing it at the end of a particular set or part or section of the experiment. Okay. Think aloud technique, a method that requires participants to verbalize their thoughts as they are performing the study. So this just would ask participants, hey, as you're doing this, just talk. Just talk aloud, say what you're thinking is happening. Just keep going, blah, 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 and tell us. Okay. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about the control of experimenter effects. Control of experimenter effects. First thing is the control of recording errors. This can involve some awareness or training. This can involve multiple data recorders or observers. Or you could just have participants make responses on the computer and remove the recording entirely. Now, I have done number 2, the multiple data recorders or observers, quite often in the past. And what I'll do is I'll have 2 people work together. One reads and looks at the screen while the other enters the data. So you have some checking going on that way. Another technique I've used is having 2 people enter the same data and then compare. You don't have to do this for every single data point. You could do it for a subset, or you could do it for all data points. Okay. Participants making responses on computers becoming, of course, more and more common, especially in these days. So that's another way to get around things too. as long as if you're going to do that, I would say make it as simple as possible for your participants to respond, because you don't want them making an error, right? So try and make it as easy as possible on them. Control of attribute errors. This refers to attributes of the experimenter. So you probably want to use the same experimenter in all treatment conditions unless the treatment condition interacts with the attributes. In other words, I kind of mentioned this before in the last lecture, right? Where if you have one experimenter who's like, hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate it, and they're really likable and all that good stuff. And you have another experimenter who comes in and is like, do this. You're going to get a difference, right? And so you want to make sure that both your experimental group and your treatment group or groups, both your experimental group and your control group are hopefully being run by the same experimenter or researcher, or if not, making sure that at least you don't have that kind of issue that I just described. Okay. And then finally, I want to talk to you about control of experimenter expectancy. What about the experimenter? What about their expectations? What about that influencing how the study will go, whether this is intentional or not? Okay. A blind technique, we talked about the double blind. Well, the single blind technique or blind technique is the experimenter half of the double blind procedure, okay? You could use it to refer to, as I mentioned before, just the participant being blind, but it's more often used for the experimenter half of the double blind procedure. Partial blind technique. Knowledge of the participant's treatment condition is kept from the experimenter through as many stages of the experiment as possible. Maybe it's not possible to keep the experimenter or researcher blind the whole time. Keep them blind for as long as you can. And finally, automate those experimental procedures. No experimenter participation interaction is required, right? Just make it all automated. Don't keep the researcher out of it. Maybe that's best. Okay. So, I know I said at the beginning that this was online lecture 15. It's actually online lectures 15 and 16. So just keep that in mind as you move forward. Okay, that's all I have for you for today. Be well, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.